involved along the way with where we started and thought we would be and kind of where we ended up at the end. Before I jump into the details here, I would like to introduce the team that we have been working with over the past 2.5 years. And I'll let her get settled here. But we formed what we call an equity policy group, a community group as part of this process. And I have with us the co-chairs who have been with us the entire time, 2 years of this project, Husnia Bradley and Edna McKenzie, and they will be giving a piece of the presentation today, and I'll let them give any more details on themselves if they so desire. We also have our consultant team with us. We have Ashley Hudson and Marcel Walker with Bolton and Menk. They have served as our project managers and facilitators of the equity policy group. And then we have Allison Bell with Bellwether Associates. Some of you might remember, formerly with Metro Transit. Allison has been working on the training piece, which is still ongoing piece of this project. Each of them will be giving a piece of the presentation. And then I did want to mention that our chair today, Chair Chambliss, also served on our equity policy group as a council representative. And we had a MnDOT representative, Sheila Kaupe, who could not be here today, but we do have Molly McCartney, who is with MnDOT's Metro District, and she also was on our project management team and has also been with us for the full 2 years of this project. So with that, our agenda today, I'm going to talk very briefly about kind of what kicked off this project, the purpose of the work. We'll turn it over to our co-chairs. Ashley will talk about the development of the equity framework and tool, the major product of this work. And then we'll turn it over to Allison to talk about the training that we're embarking on and that will be taking place over the next year or so. And then at the end, we have a couple questions for you, and we'll talk about future work that we discovered we need to do related to this. But in addition to at the end having a discussion, if you have questions along the way, certainly interrupt us, ask questions so we can address it along the way too. The next slide, please. As you're all aware, equity has been both a value and a goal for the council for over a decade now, an important piece of the work that we're all doing. Specifically, this equity statement was, we are challenged really to create systems, policies, programs that repair and heal past harm, foster an equitable future, and eliminate disparities. So the council developed this value statement. I think the challenge was really to us as the business unit leaders to think about what work should we be doing, how can the work that we're involved in also address the equity statement, what new work should we be doing, and that really was the impetus for the work we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. Hopefully, as you're also aware, during the 2050 work, we did adopt an equity framework for the council. Again, I think of this framework as really guiding the work that we're doing. I somewhat think of this as a three-legged stool for equity work, with the first stool being that the work that we are doing should be addressing a systemic inequity. I think this project does that. We are really focused on identifying how transportation investment processes unfold, how should they think about equity as they unfold, where can they incorporate equity, where do we have inequities embedded into our transportation investment processes. And then the second leg of the stool, community-centered, and doing the equity work with impacted people and communities and co-creating solutions. That really was the purpose of our equity policy group that was with us, really led the work that we did, gave us strong advice along the way, and really directed the work to where we think it needed to go. Then the third leg of the stool, reparative, to do equity work that really is aimed at enacting solutions and actions that are on the same scale as the inequity that we're addressing. I think a little bit it remains to be seen if we've accomplished that with this tool, because it's the implementation of the tool itself and the use of the tool by us, by MnDOT, by our city and county partners that will really prove out whether that occurs over time or not. Next slide. So that is kind of where this work came from in transportation planning, thinking about how can we actualize equity in the work that we are doing, how can we address systemic inequities. The council, as you might remember, 2.5 years ago, made available over $3 million in local funds that the business units within the council essentially competed for. We were successful in proposing this project. Our original vision was a $400,000, 18-month project. Over time, once we got into the work, started working with the equity policy group and discussing the work itself, our budget grew to $800,000. We're now at 2.5 years. We have a lot of new work identified, and I'm incorporating that future work into our future transportation planning program. And so this is really work that I envision continuing on for years as we address different aspects of it. I do want to tell you that added budget did come from MTS, not from the $3 million, but that was certainly needed, and I think the future work fits really well with what transportation planning is already doing anyway, and so it fits into our future work program planning and won't require special funding from the council. The original proposal for this work, you can see on this slide, is we originally were thinking that we would look at how we're investing in transportation, different project types, and take those processes and kind of evaluate them for how they included or did not include equity. And then we also envisioned that we would identify actions and things that should be incorporated into the processes and kind of label them as high, medium, low, like the most important to do, maybe medium, maybe least important. I think in hindsight that was a very ambitious proposal, and we definitely did pieces of it, and maybe not all of it, but hope to get to some of it in the future. The piece that we did propose was working with the equity policy group in co-creating our evaluation tool. That was a very successful piece of the work. We learned a lot about working with community and working with community groups. Very fulfilling piece of work overall. I think I've told a number of people I've been doing transportation work for 30 plus years, and this really has been one of the best pieces of work I think I've done. So really enjoyable work that we've done. If I were to go back and think about what we did and how to title it today, I would say a title such as bringing equity into regional transportation investment processes is really where we focused, and the conversation that we had with our equity policy group. The idea that somehow there are things that are most important to do or medium or less important, that really didn't resonate with the equity policy group. I think in general, the message was it's all important. Anything we can do to bring equity and decision-making and community and co-creating solutions into our investment processes, all of that is important. And somehow doing any of it is even more important. So whatever can be done is important. With that, I will turn it over to the co-chairs to talk about their work, and also then we'll kick off the video.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Husnia Bradley. I live in Richfield, and also one of the co-chairs of the Equity Policy Group. We were, we stepped up, nominated, and were elected as the co-chairs, so that was a great process. I've been involved with transportation on different levels. I see a number of you at the TAB meetings. I'm in the TAB representing District C, and then also the Richfield Transportation Commission. I've been doing that for at least 5 years. But this group, the EPG group, was made up of different kind of like stakeholders from different parts of the region. So like we had people from Carver, Ramsey, Niphin, and other areas providing input in their perspectives on transportation from their perspective. It did not necessarily include people that had experience in transportation, but it included people that have used different modes of transportation.
Thank you. So I am Edna McKenzie. I am the other co-chair, and I just wanted to add to what my co-chair said, was that this was a very informative process. I represent the Brooklyn Park area. I did bring to this group a little background experience because I am in transportation, planning, and construction management as a consultant. So equity work is important to me, and it has always been a core value of mine, even in past careers. So I was pleased to be invited to be a member of this process, and I'm definitely pleased with the work that we produced, and I hope that this council finds it informative and can guide your processes, because it's about the people. So it was very human-centered, and we got a lot of feedback. I learned a lot from different perspectives that were in the room. So it's definitely a learning process, and we definitely shared. Thank you.
Well, as for the, if you go back to the past screen, as you can see from the screen, and I think you mentioned it, there were different there were different partners that were involved with bringing this together, and then we'll go ahead with the video.
Okay, I will see. It doesn't seem like we have sound right now.
You all have to tell us what they're saying.
The transcript.
Oh, it's terrible.
Difficulty here.
Okay. I was saying too,
Yes, come. Great.
maybe while that's loading up, if there's anything you wanted to add, Amy, to the.
Yeah, that audio won't go through the HDMI.
Oh, okay.
You can turn up your volume on your PC.
Okay, while they're trying to figure out the technical difficulties, maybe give a little bit of my perspective.
microphone.
Yeah, we have to try and do it through the computer.
Oh, yeah,
We
you can
can't
mic
get
it.
the audio is not gonna come through, so we're here.
Okay,
Just hold a mic up to the computer audio and it might go through.
Let me test that.
so while she's working on that, I will just say that it was a pleasure to be a part of that group. You can imagine how many meetings that they had over a 2-year period, so it was very They had to make a large commitment to be a part of the process. And every time that I attended, it was very well attended. They did receive a small stipend for participating, and they also received food, and the meetings were in the evening, very close to the dinner time. And I think that does make a difference when people are giving up so much of their valuable time for that long of a time period. To have so many people be dedicated throughout the entire process was very encouraging. Many of these participants in the study have been very engaged in their communities, just like the two that we have here today, Husnia and Edna. And I think this tool is going to be transformational in terms of how other organizations, entities, municipalities might be able to utilize some of the pieces that have been put together by the EPG group and its consultants. Are we ready?
I'm gonna test this.
Is powerless.
Transportation projects do affect people's lives.
What's the best way to implement effective transportation without destroying communities? My name is Angela Williams and I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
My name is John Chikala and I am from the city of Woodbury.
My name is Husnia Bradley and I'm from Richfield.
Hi, I'm Judy Conklin. I live in Minneapolis.
Hi, my name is Joe Bruder. I'm from Watertown, Minnesota.
My name is Edna McKenzie, and I am from Brooklyn Park.
Hi, I'm Tanya Long and I live in Ramsey County.
From 2022 through 2024, the Metropolitan Council convened an Equity Policy Group, or EPG, of community members from across the Twin Cities region. The EPG developed a transportation equity framework and tool to assess transportation processes through an equity lens and provide recommendations to make those processes more equitable.
So I serve on the EPG because I'd like to lend my voice to kind of like future developments of transportation systems in the state of Minnesota. I currently serve on the Transportation Advisory Board. This is within the Met Council. And I've seen definitely a need for a diversity of voices and people bringing different things to the table.
Just being a part of the American Indian community and being such a low population, we're normally not counted because we're less than 3% of the population. So if I see equity, I come forward.
I serve on the EPG because I'm a person who believes that if you want better government, private citizens need to step up and sit on committees and boards like this.
So anytime there is an issue or an opportunity to make things better for communities, I want to be a part of that. So I'm bringing the voices of other community members to this panel in hopes to create change.
Transportation equity is really important because it's mobility essentially is power. People being able to get to where they need to go efficiently and effectively allows people to do the things that they need to thrive in their lives.
Transportation is one of the main aspects of life, how we go about our daily living. So I believe there is equity among the population. Our diversity is so important. Just like we all want to have fair opportunity, right? We all want to have a shot at what we are trying to do.
It matters because we're a community, we're family. Neighborhoods are families. And it's important because the idea of transportation shouldn't disrupt familiar communication. You know what I'm trying to say? Like your neighbors next door, we're all together. So when we have transportation, we gotta consider the communities that you're coming in, the people that you're serving. What's the best way to implement effective transportation without destroying communities?
So there's a couple more minutes to that. Play more of it or kind of move on?
I think, well, this is online, we should
Yep.
tell you, we have a project site on the council's website, and so this is on there, and I would encourage you all to go read more about this project and then maybe watch the full video.
And I'd add a big reason why we made the video is recognition that, you know, the EPG and the capacity to pay them and keep them involved can't live on forever, but we want to make sure that their voices stay involved in the continuation of this framework and tool and the use of it and the trainings that we'll go into. So with that, I'll hand it back to you guys. And I'll get this back a little bit.
So I'll go over the work model that we had in place. So we had a study team mapped common transportation project processes. So we were given a number of different modes of transportation, and our group kind of went through and prioritized them. So everyone would select maybe their top 3, and we came together. I guess the team put those together and put which ones were the top 3, and if they had any that were competing, then we discussed them to see which ones to move forward with. In the end, we went through and probably narrowed it down to at least 2 of the modes in order to try to develop the framework of the tool on. And then the EPG developed a framework and tool recommendations for equitable processes. And so with that, we just received, you know, different recommendations from the different community members that included their input. And then again, we would always kind of take into consideration or which ones were more important. And sometimes there's particular ones that helped lead the conversation, and that's how we move forward with those. And then the study team to develop training guide for agency use of framework and tool, and that's going on now. After we completed the tool, then it was kind of like fine-tuned, and they went through and kind of tested it, or at least you're in the process of doing that, and then they'll come up with a training guide for the agency use. So for the equity policy group, the EPG's guiding values: transparency, equitable burdens and benefits, and that came along with, you know, weighing options and taking everybody's comments and ideas into consideration. And then shared accountability. So that came apart in like several of the conversations that we had to describe why we were taking those steps. So and bring people along. So we might have had, you know, different competing things where some people did not believe. So let's say we were talking about communities that have been impacted in the past, like the Rondo community or with 35W, and there might have been members on the team that did not believe that that really occurred. And so then we had to, I guess, explain the situation to them and bring them along to be able to consider what could be equitable after those types of projects occurred.
Madam Chair, just for clarification, did people in the process didn't realize that it occurred or the impacts of those 2 projects as that example? There were people in the process that didn't even understand that? Is that what you, really? Okay. Wow, this is, you know, that's important. I just want to really soak that in for a minute.
Yeah, if I can jump in, my name is Marcel Walker. I was one of the facilitators a part of this work, and lived experiences also showed, as it showed in us collecting that input, that it also showed that others didn't understand the history of transportation from others' perspectives. So there, in terms of sharing accountability, there also became out of this process shared values, which was really important because there was some on the committee who did not know that what happened to Rondo happened.
Thank you for that. I just needed to hear that. And I'm gonna think about that one for a long time.
Great question, and if we have further explanation from consultants, feel free to come up and we can get you a mic too.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
And then genuine inclusion, so including everyone's idea and perspective. Shared decision making, and that came with looking at the different avenues to take in the different transportation modes, different processes to make a decision that was going to be equitable for everyone in the room and also move us forward on creating an equitable outcome. And then resources. So using kind of like our past resources, or we had handouts at each meeting and different things that we discussed and went over. And we actually started out with almost like a mock problem that may have included some elements of different transportation issues. I don't know if you want to say, or okay, different issues that are occurring in the region and how would we solve them and how would we use a tool to solve that issue.
Maybe, I'll just add there, so we put together a representative transportation investment process. It wasn't any real project in the region, but we had looked at a number of processes. And then we put that process before the EPG and really asked the question, how could this have been better? Where could this have changed? How could community have been involved in different ways? And we broke the process up into different steps or phases, and at each piece of the project, they had different recommendations on what it could have looked like had equity been considered as part of that process.
Madam Chair, just another quick question. When you talk about the process, where are you starting in the process? What is the beginning? Is it an idea? Is it something that shows up because somebody else already got it going and oh my gosh? Or what is the beginning of the process? Maybe it can be several things, but the earlier I would think the better.
Excellent.
Well, I'm gonna put that question off a little, because Ashley's gonna get there. Though I'll tell you, a learning for all of us, and you know, I'm embedded in this every day. We have so many processes and they are complex and they're different. No matter if transit does it this way, transit facilities does it this way, transit operations does it this way, highway, arterials do it this way. You know, our processes are all different across the board and they're not written down. And so as professionals, we were looking at that thinking, how can you change something where we don't even have these processes written down and every project does it differently. So that was a learning for us, and we have recommendations and future work. And that's really important because you can't change a process or make it more equitable if you haven't written it down and understand what your steps are gonna be.
Wow.
And we'll get into that a little bit more.
Okay, well, excuse me. Well, that brings us to how we derived at our definition. So the EPG's transportation equity definition, it's a lot of words, but before we read it or unpack it, a couple of things to know is that one is based on our guiding values, first of all. We wanted what is going to be the impact. We thought about impact of equitable system and process. We needed this to be human-centered. And so as a starting point for coming up with our own definition, we listened to MnDOT, Representative MnDOT shared their equity definition. And so we took from that and developed our own. And so this is serving as our framework for the work that went forth. Okay? So now we'll just read through it and then I'm going to unpack certain major words. Every word, I think, is very important to this definition, and I think if I give a couple of examples, you'll understand why. So first, transportation equity means benefits and burdens of transportation systems, services, and spending are fair and just, which historically has not been the case. And transportation equity requires acknowledging, addressing, and repairing past harms, particularly impacting underserved Black, African, Latina, Asian, and indigenous people, including tribal nations. It also calls for active, intentional inclusion of underserved communities in shaping transportation decisions. And this is what we came up with the Equity Policy Group. So let's just talk a little bit about equity needs benefits and burdens of transportation systems are fair and just. So a couple of projects are going on now where people may not think that it's fair or just to them to be disrupting their neighborhood, their highway system, and they're going to pay a cost. They're going to be displaced. They're going to have a higher tax base, while another group of folks are coming in and get to ride through the highway. So I talk to people and I'm representing what people understand a project to be and to do for them and how it harms. So even though a benefit may be you're going to get an improved signalized intersection and you're going to save lives eventually with that improvement, but does that justify the cost that community members that's been there for years are going to bear? So I was at, another example, I was at doing a community tour in another state. They tore down affordable housing, and in this state and in this city, affordable housing is just rare. They tore it down because the representatives of that council wanted green space. How is that fair and how is that equitable? I'm like, you just wanted green space? Yeah. So you displaced over 700 families who already can't afford housing because you wanted to see green space. So going into what is the impact of communities, especially underserved communities. We may go in with a good idea that we're going to plan and then we're going to implement, and that's going to be a great improvement. But we need to really look at the impact. Who's going to be impacted? Is it a homeless situation? Is there food shelves? Is there communities? Is there medical care that's going to be eliminated because we're doing an investment improvement? Then you really need to know who your people are, who are your stakeholders. And active, intentional inclusion, you really need to do that community mapping process to find out your resources, who are your community leaders, to make sure that you're reaching the people that's really going to be impacted. And there's a way to do that. That's a timely process. We know it to be. Not everyone shows up in a meeting that we think they should. So we need to look for better ways to engage the public. So this is all going to be coming down to public engagement and identifying the community members, resources, and really understanding what our impact is going to be, good or bad, on that investment decision.
Can I have a quick question on this one too? So that's when something's already proposed. How do we get that before something's already proposed and there's, let's find a metaphor. There's already a foot on the pedal and it's, screaming down the highway. No puns intended, or maybe puns intended. But that's what keeps me up at night as somebody who's been in government for a while. And at council, we get a lot of things going. And then all of a sudden we kind of unveil it to community and start engagement. And I'm like, that's just so backwards to me. And then what do we do, right? So I just want you to know my mindset as I'm hearing all of this, because it really matters at what point community I mean, to me, community should stand up and say, this is what we want, and that should be the beginning of the process, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, yes. So that is what we hope that you guys take away, that we need a better process. So this is guiding, but you guys have to take it and set it as policy or establish the process, or this is the way we're going to do it.
Councilmember Clark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I skipped ahead, looked through all the slides, and I think that was one of the points I was going to get to. Maybe you will address it. I think I see the need, I see the recommendation that says create process and guidelines, but what I'm not seeing is that part. And so the year and a half that I've been on that council, so this is a general comment, I think the way transportation projects are recommended, our core sort of stakeholder or partners are local government, counties, townships, cities. And I have not seen, and one of the directors could correct me, on how community-led projects are coming through. And that's the big missing gap in transportation planning done. That's my observation even when I worked on transportation and worked really closely with, at that point, both MnDOT and Met Council. Transportation is still an area that is very much engineer, local government led. Like you will see the interchange that needs to be done, or you have the new businesses that are coming in. So you're like, I need this one rail grid or one chain line that connects to another highway. That's often how it's done. And I don't think, even just reflecting both with our Vision 2050 planning and Network Now, I don't think, and somebody correct me here because I could be wrong, I don't think we have ever had a process where community-led groups or community visioning of how projects are done differently, or what projects should be advanced, whether it's a bus route or train lines. And so this is where I think this is beyond Met Council. This is a combination of just both the planning infrastructure as a field, and then the second part is a partnership between MnDOT, Met Council, counties, and cities. For the most part, you have dedicated planners who think about this day in and day out. They do a really good job, and that's where I was going to mention, like, I'm not seeing that in the recommendation, but I think that may be something that is beyond and bigger than Met Council. I would like to see a process in which community groups can advance projects, and how they show up in Met Council list of projects that needs to be funded, and how they're prioritized or categorized differently than when a local government submits a project. So that's my general thought and comment around it, and what I saw is missing when I started scrolling through the slide decks.
Thank you. I think that is a good question. This is to be a co-created equity tool. Can you speak to that, and also the training and how that might be incorporated?
I know we plan to go a little over the tool, and at different parts of the tool, including the beginning, there's a part on community involvement and collecting community input, because we've seen, even as of late, a couple of transportation projects that did not receive community input, and now they're having to either go back to the drawing board, or it's delaying projects, a couple of years because of that, but
Yes. Yeah, and we'll probably get a little bit to these questions, but I'm gonna ask Ashley if you could go to that funnel.
Yes.
So this was part of mapping processes and was a very difficult activity that we undertook, and we ended up, so in the best of all worlds, projects kind of do this. We identify a problem, we go to planning and project implementation, then we find the funding, then we get into project engineering and delivery, and then we construct. And at each of these steps, community should be involved. But what we discovered as we tried to map investment processes is many processes don't follow this order. Sometimes we find the funding first. And if you find your funding first, you can do that, but you have to go backwards and really work with community on some of these first steps, which is, does the community agree there's a problem? Do they understand the problem? Do they agree it needs to be solved? Do they agree we have the right alternatives? And so we have investment processes that somewhat do things out of order, and then even when they do them out of order, they're not involving the community in ways that we would suggest and that the EPG suggested need to occur. So the draft tool we're gonna talk about has essentially questions at each of these phases regarding equity and how community has been involved. And I think one of your points is, at the very top, sometimes these problems do come from the community. Sometimes we have transportation issues, problems that the community brings to the forefront, and then we move through an investment process and solve. And those are really good, important processes, but oftentimes the problem comes from state of good repair or a champion who just wants to do this. And so when that occurs, we have to be really ask ourselves questions about equity, because that problem is not coming from the community. And then we have to essentially go backwards and say, okay, we're bringing this forward, but where is the community at? And I'm talking about community very broadly here, but essentially adjacent communities. And so that was a lot of what we discussed in our work, is how do you think about equity when these processes aren't always in this order and are coming from different places. So it got complicated fast.
And to that point, again, the stuff that keeps me up at night is engaging community, and I know that Met Council works very hard at that, and I mean, you know, it's a thing, really. And I also know that people in community, whether it's geographic community or community in how we organize our faith or our beliefs or our history or whatever it might be culturally, are just busy people trying to live their lives. And they might be blocks away from something, and until something is actually changing physically, they may be so unaware. And the good-hearted organization or group or whoever is advancing a project is trying to reach out, meet people where they're at. And yet it just seems backwards to me, because that's where you start to get people who are like, hey, did you think about this? Or hey, these are the impacts. And at that point, to your point, Amy, funding may have been identified or it may not, or the local governments have signed on or not, or it's a state project or not. And it, to me, having been doing this for 20-some years, just feels like this piece about getting community in as it's still an idea or an application for funding is potentially gonna happen, needs to really happen, even if it's door knocking or something, because once these things pick up steam, they go. And then you're remediating and you're backtracking. And to me, that is what, you know, you got Rondo, and what, 50, 60 years later, we're still trying to fix something. And I just don't wanna slip down that slide where we've already gone past a critical stage pre-anything to make sure people are centered where the project will happen, where those benefits or burdens are taking place, so that we don't go back and go, gee, now we gotta figure out how to undo this, or maybe we do, you know, and that's what I just, if you can get there, this is huge, because we aren't there, and you know that. But I'm just telling you, we do have projects, and I've got a project coming up in my community, maybe on Highway 55 yet, and I'm thinking to myself, we already should be doing this stuff now. So, you know.
We have a tool for it.
Yes.
Yes. So do you wanna round out, I know we've gotten a little all over topics and we'll come back to some of that, do you wanna round out like the EPG, just or how the meetings went?
We mostly covered this already, but they were in person, hybrid. There was always food, there's one-on-one conversations to make sure no one's voices was left out of any conversation. Maybe they didn't wanna say anything in a large group, that they got an opportunity to do one-on-one or send directly or communicate directly with the consultants on the team. So that was very important. We always,
We had separate meetings.
yeah, and then we had separate meetings with the consultants bringing this forth. So, very, very good process going on, so. I'll just go quickly, frequent communications, the EPG as a group, they want to stay engaged in this work to see how you guys advance the work. So if this is a guide or a framework, they want to know how you've advanced it or what success you've had if you implemented any portion of this. So because it is your process, your directive is what's going to change.
Before we move on from really talking about the EPG and the EPG process, is there anything anybody wanted to add or any questions on that? Because then I think we're gonna get a little bit more into talking about the tool.
Well, Councilmember Carter.
I do appreciate that we'll be getting more into talking about the tools specifically, but I just wanted to add my thanks and also share that with these processes moving together, the work that you are delivering, the recommendations that you are delivering, the work on the regional development guide, the work on the regional solicitation for transportation. You know, I'm hoping there are a lot of lines being drawn because certainly one informs the other, and what you have done can be informative to all of those as we look to providing what we can to our municipalities to help guide the beginnings of their work. Not that we need to wait for the next 20, 40 years,
Right.
but we need to be doing that kind of guidance today for those projects that are going to be coming forward.
Regional Administrator.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just one thing that always is important to state here as we're thinking this through and as our teams are trying to digest all of the process work and analysis. I mean, the tool matters, and that's always a big part, and we're about to talk about it. Building trust matters because part of what you learn through all the processes is no two processes look exactly the same, but if you work together and start to see the ways in which an agency is either trying or not trying to lean directly into the work, that starts to become evident. And we've all been parts of processes on probably both sides of that coin at different times, but the trust gets built through the process. So first of all, I appreciate you all leading a process that can hopefully build that trust. And then the last part, I think the transparency to the process is a really important part of building trust as well. Because there is this false choice sometimes that there are perfect projects of which no one will object. And I loved your setup earlier, which even things like rising values in an area where an investment gets made cut both ways at any given time. That can be good for wealth building, but really bad for short-term livability. And how to weigh that is one of those things where people smarter than I haven't figured it out, so I'm gonna keep leaning into it with everybody else. But I just think a lot about that tool, trust, and transparency piece, and I think the way you frame this is really helpful and something that we can continue to use. The tool is a technical answer, and it's an important part, but it alone is not sufficient to some of those other pieces that you've really helped build through this process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead,
Just
Johnson
one-
and then Marcel.
Thank you. Just one thing I want to say too about transparency. Regular people don't know how the processes work. It took a lot of us a few years being at Met Council to figure out, okay, how does this really go? Who's leading a project? Who's starting this? How does this thing get figured out? How does the mode get, how does the alignment? You know, regular people, again, are busy. If we were called to sit around this table right now, we would not know any of this stuff either, and that's everybody out there. So I think transparency starts even with just some education so people know this entity does this entity does this is where you can intersect, because if people don't know how to manage the process themselves, representing their family, their person, their job, their community, their church, their whatever, they can't engage in effectively in the process. They're showing up perhaps in places at the wrong time, at the wrong place, or not knowing who's in charge. That is huge in government. I've learned that again in some 20 years. And empowering people, it's a kind of a civics lesson, but you don't get it in ninth grade civics, that's for sure. But I think that we have to really remind ourselves that not everybody
is supposed to meet us where we're at. That is not how public service works. And I just wanna get that out there too, because it's just hard to help people to understand, you know, they come to you, well, I don't even know where to go or who should I talk to? And it might be a whole complicated answer based on whatever it is they're trying to do, right? So I think we own some responsibility in that as well.
Well, you're gonna love some of the recommendations for our next work.
Marcel and then Councilmember Joker.
Yeah, and just on that, the need for meeting people where they are and bringing them into the conversation and inviting them, that played out very clearly with the EPG. And I just wanted to step in and just round out the conversation before we move on into the tool to actually promote more opportunities where co-creation is truly happening. And that's what this process was about. And that's why you see on there that the members that were part of this group are still invested, even though they're not a part of this process. So co-creation takes time, patience, and shared understanding. And the shared understanding in the building and team building that we went through, even in spaces where people were saying, Rondo didn't happen. We had to talk through that. Those were difficult conversations. And so just to be a part of this process where true co-creation was happening, the reward is this tool. So really, really promoting more opportunities where we are at the table pushing for more co-creation with community, and that goes for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Joker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to hold off on saying the two comments until the end, but Councilmember Johnson's comments are making me say this earlier. So one, I'll just say thank you. The figuring out how to actually actualize equity or make equity work in transportation planning, building, and budgeting has been like near and dear to my heart, and that's pretty much what I think about for the last 4 years. That's what I do. One thing I will say is this assessment tool and the tool that they will walk through, they're just a tool. And those of us who have worked with local government, counties and cities, and even at the state, and have watched sort of the GARES tool around racial equity, know it's just a tool. It really depends on what institutions do with it, who has authority to make it have a little bit more teeth to it than just a screening tool. And so that's the background scene. I think that is really important because you could have every one of the planners use this, but if it actually doesn't influence how we change our planning to how we budget, to how we actually build, it doesn't mean anything. So that's one thing I will say. The second thing I'll say is in the last 1.5 years, which is surprising, but since I've been on the council, I have consistently said, I think there's a need for a transportation equity. Ryan and Chair, I think I've said this on a couple of different occasions. And the reason I say it is Met Council is a very unique entity when we think about MPOs across the nation in the sense that we have both the planning part and the building part. And what I'm often left with is the intentions are there. Met Council has probably one of a really strong equity and racial equity and community-oriented way of thinking about how we want to do our work. But where I think the gaps are happening is, we're still very much siloed in the way we do our work, and I think it benefits from having somebody who's a little bit more central, who can oversee multiple different parts of moving pieces. So I'll just repeat that recommendation again for the need for a transportation equity person in this role. And a lot of states, a lot of cities, a lot of counties who have seen the need as things have gotten more complicated are seeing it, they're creating that position. So I think there are models out there that we can look at. And then the last comment I will make is, as we're thinking about the tool and we're talking about communities, one part that is still fairly new in public projects are community benefits agreement. The idea that, and I don't know if it'll show up in your tool beyond the questions, but the idea is really like you evaluate every project and you have a community benefits agreement with communities that are going to be impacted or along the project. Now that's easier said as a framework and something that I can propose as a policymaker, but it's actually harder to do in practice. And I don't know if there's any good model. There's some projects that got grant from federal government that are energy, that are seeing community benefits agreement, that have very strong worker rights, have strong labor standards, have ideas of how you will do some sort of wealth transfer from like old industry to new industry, but I haven't seen a really good one on transportation projects.
So, 3 comments, thank you.
Thank you. Good comments. Continue.
Okay, oh, was there anything else?
No.
Okay, I'll keep us moving on. The last thing I'll say to round this out before we really dive into just talking a little bit more about the tool is, you know, you've heard, and you'll probably hear again, lessons learned. This was a pilot process, really from the beginning. We had no other model to follow, and as Amy said earlier, you know, Met Council came into this, you know, with a scope and an idea of how they wanted to do it, and that changed as we formed the EPG and started to work with the EPG. So that's where we really get to the lessons on working with community that were very beneficial in this, even though things didn't exactly go as planned. And that is, as everybody's been talking about, is the flexibility and the time that it takes to do this type of work, and that we need to plan for that. Going back on it, I would say if we did this all over again, you know, not coming in with such a prescribed scope, having an idea, but bringing the EPG in and then working with them to lay that out and making them a part of that process would have probably worked a lot better. On the slide before, something that you know, it was the EPG feedback lesson learned thing that we did was a mid-study assessment, because we felt the frustration and we kind of felt the rub between like the scope that we had, but really where the EPG could take us. And we stopped and we paused, and we were all honest with each other, like we're pausing, we need to pause, why we need to pause, and we were very honest on what was working, what wasn't working, and how do we move forward. And we actually lended power to the EPG to define that further for us. And that was massive, that was huge. Something Amy has said from very early on in this study is you cannot have an equitable outcome unless you have an equitable process. And that resonated with us with how we worked with the EPG, and then we talked about that a lot and how that needs to come through in the tool and how it needs to also prepare the future use of this for the communities using it, that they need to plan for that in this type of work. Like you can't put a predefined scope and budget to it before you talk to the community about what the needs and the problems really are. So we could probably go into a lot of detail back and forth, but those were some huge lessons learned that came out of this of working with community. So now getting into, we sent you a link to the tool, I believe in an email that went out. This QR code will take you to it as well too. The tool itself, it's definitely started to get some content to it, so we're not gonna like go through it page by page, but we really encourage everybody, if you haven't, to spend time with it and look at it. I wanna also emphasize that what we've shared is a current draft. It's gonna be a living draft, a working draft, because we still need to go through the training and capacity building, which we know is gonna help kind of further shape this, because you know, we worked with the EPG, or the EPG led development of it, but we really haven't truly, honestly trained this like with partner agencies to test where holes are, or where things need to be developed further. So, but at a high level, the framework is the how-to guide for the use of the tool. So there's kind of 2 parts to this document. There's the framework, and that really talks about even too where it came from. You know, the role the EPG had in it. It talks about their values. It gives their transportation equity definition. It shares all of that with the user up front. And then the tool is really the set of questions and then recommendations that the EPG provided of like what could be equitable answers to those questions, and or what are things that you really need to be thinking about in your process to define an equitable process. And some of this we've already talked about, but you know, this started to lead to where there's holes in this, in the sense of like what is work we're gonna need to do after this phase, this study, to help successful implementation of this framework and tool. But like as Amy said, we learned, or I don't think we were super surprised, but it confirmed for us that there is no one process for a project. That's across agencies, that's within agencies. Things are done very differently depending on where the need comes from, depending on what type of project it is. So how can you explain to the public what a process is when we don't always fully understand it ourselves?
Chair, just one, again, I really appreciate this. What kind of catches me though is when we say there is no one process for a project, before we use the word project, just project means something's gonna happen to a lot of people. You know what I mean? Oh, it's already a project. You know, I think this is stuff that happens pre-project, and I don't know how you say that, but this triggers me because I'm like, oh, we're already into a project phase, we've already got staff assigned, we've already got probably some money identified. Typically, policymakers for sure, or people in general, go, oh, it's already a project, it's a thing. I think the work that we're doing here is ahead of that. So I don't know how maybe you don't wanna change it, but I'm just saying it reads to me like, oh, this is something we'll bring into a project that's already happening. And we want it during the project, but I think again, it has to be very early stage.
Exactly. We struggled with wording a lot throughout all of this, and I think all of that will evolve as we evolve the framework and tool, and words are very important in this. So I would not say we're opposed to changing any of this. Just to kind of continue this or keep this moving, again, sometimes with all of those complicated processes and different processes, we've learned that often even those on the project teams, they can't even tell you what the process is or who the decision makers are or when it's happening. So how do you transparently share that with the public? And then what the next slide's gonna lay it out a little bit more, but you cannot effectively, we really then determine that you can't effectively use this framework and tool that the EPG is developing unless you have done a detailed assessment mapping of the community that is going to be impacted by that project or potential project, and you've mapped out your anticipated process, the milestones, the decision making, the decision makers, all of that in detail. So these were things that we had to think about is like, how is this gonna shape how this is evolving, but also future work we know we need to do. So this framework, or this is in the framework part of the tool, and this is a first, stab at trying to explain to the user of the tool, the process of it. And also something that we talked about is this is not something that just one person on a project or within an agency should sit down with. This should be a team exercise. And you see step one, conduct that community assessment mapping. And we know we need to do future work to define what that is. The EPG in the tool started to kind of lay out some ideas of what should show up in that community assessment mapping far beyond, just the demographic data that's readily available and that is often grabbed and just ran with. So that is work we need to evolve more so that when we, roll this out, to partners to utilize, we can tell them how to do this or what really are community expectations for that. Step two, again, is mapping that decision-making process. We're gonna have to do more work to help users understand, well, how do I map that? Because I think you'd get varying different levels of that. Or we already do that, we throw the project milestones on a schedule at boards at open houses, and it does not go into the depth that is truly needed for an equitable process. And so really this then kind of gets at too, in an ideal situation, we would want a team or leads within an agency, the decision makers on investments and where investments are gonna happen. We would want them to sit down with us at the very onset of any of that conversation, because the tool is, we'll get to that funnel that Amy, actually I'll just jump to it now. The tool is really set up to where each section, it has sections of questions that really get at these common phases in, I don't even want to say project, because again, identification of an investment need. And really the idea is sit down with it at the beginning, but the tool is worded in a way where it makes you go back. You should be going back to it and reevaluating where you're at. Have you done enough work? Where do you need to pause and go back and do more work with community before you can advance this? But we also want to communicate too that just because you didn't pick this up in the beginning doesn't mean you shouldn't utilize it. You could still pick this up mid-process and learn from it. Pause, take time to go back and do work before a project advances too far and it's too late to correct anything. And so if one more on this, but really how I kind of got at how this is divided up, there's the framework section, then there's the tool, but within the tool, how the tool is divided up is there's questions, And this, even to the look of this, we think it might evolve, it might change a little bit as we actually test it in capacity and training. But there's the questions, there's the EPG recommendations, and then there is very intentionally, even just a section at the end of each tool section that like, what are your next steps and action items? What can you not answer? What do you still need to do to be able to answer those questions in an equitable way? So it's very intentional to make the user stop, pause, and think about where they need to go back.
Yeah, Ryan?
Just one kind of technical question, but was there any conversation within the group or within staff after the group about, when I think about transportation here, there's projects initiated, led from the outset by the council, and then there's a whole realm of work where we serve in this more intermediary role that some council members have already discussed, where you're recipients of things that often come outside. Did we talk about the different ways in which we need to think about how that tool might play? I mean, the tool has value across both, to be frank. Did you talk about that at all? Did we wrestle with that yet, or is that something we need to wrestle with afterwards, I guess is what I want to know.
Well, I think, Madam Chair and
Ryan, that's
Ryan,
yeah.
okay. I think I would put it a little bit differently, and that's that first piece of the funnel of where did this problem and thing we're trying to solve come from?
Right.
And so sometimes, it's really important to understand that. Like, did this problem come from an entity that really just wants this investment for this reason? And understanding what's driving what we think of as the need, and then going back and verifying that need for the project or investment with community is, and I think a little bit, when we inherit projects, we inherit that too. So sometimes projects come to us, but we might still need to go back and verify that the community is on board and that the community work has been done and that there's support. And we've done some of this with Transitways already, particularly with requiring local support and resolutions of support. So pieces of that are already occurring. But yeah, that I call it more verifying that community support is really important. And it doesn't just happen at the beginning, because these projects and processes change, and sometimes you have to go back and say, okay, are they still in support even as this has changed? And I think the tool has questions at each phase that kind of tries to get at that. Is the community still on board with us? Are we still communicating with the community? And
have you learned anything new that makes you go back and redo some of your community asset mapping or your decision-making mapping? Yep.
Thanks.
Can I have a follow-up on that? So that was good, because, you're right. Well, I'm just, we generate our own things, but a city can, a county can, whoever can, right? And it's not always a problem, it's an opportunity. But when you get deep into it, that's why I think in part we developed a transitway advancement policy, which I think was very wise on behalf of the council in our role and what we will need to advance a project within a corridor, a transitway. And I can see this at some point being embedded. The bringing equity, I think we should be calling it embedding equity, because this could be embedded, and I defer to the transportation chair who she knows, so much about all this, but that, before we take a project on, we should absolutely make sure this has happened. And if we take a project on, and it hasn't happened, or something happens in the project or the community or the world around us, for gosh sakes, you never know when Mother Nature strikes or other bad actors strike, but things happen and you have to take a pause, because life can change drastically for people. And there are a lot of things that motivate and drive people, but fear is one of them. And so I've seen that, we've all seen that, and so I just think that as we move forward doing this, we have to have a big line to the transitway advancement policy. And And the resolutions of support are important, but that's at the city council level. It's gotta come way before that. If the city council's gonna give us a resolution of support, which we require in our transitway advancement policy, that is not municipal consent, which I think we should revisit municipal consent, because I think there are unequitable things happening in municipal consent that we haven't thought about in the past on how that all works. I just am thinking this is good work and it's complicated and it's gonna be messy, but it's, you know, I just am really excited about this and, you know, I'm just a policymaker here, so everybody's gotta really believe in this. But if there's communities out there who are not doing this, this council or the Metropolitan Council should really think twice about taking on a project or getting in too deep. And we should be real grown up about that. And that's what I wanna say, so thank you.
Thank you. The beauty of this work is that it creates that framework that we can apply to a lot of different things. And I do believe you said that in the future we wanted to apply it to our transportation policy plan.
Yep, go ahead.
I guess also to add to that, so like we currently have, let's say, the regional solicitation process, and for the applicants, it asks them, you know, will this impact the community and things like that, but this goes a step further, and it will, like was mentioned, there's questions that they can ask themselves and ask of their city to see if it actually falls within that guideline or framework, and that will provide answers to whoever's reviewing those applications, because I've gone through the scoring before on whether or not it fits, you know, and would give it a 1 or a 6 or 10. And so this will help inform the reviewers that are reviewing those applications, and then also whoever's filling those out, because sometimes some cities will include the same answer for all 3 applications that they submit. And some cities and areas, they receive funding more than other areas because it's weighted heavier. And also they might know how to fill out the application correctly in order to get that funding. And so this will help kind of like either equal the playing field, or it will input equity into the process.
Okay, the last thing before, because I want to hand this over to Allison to talk about a super important part of this, which is capacity building and training. So we talked a lot about this, but this was just a sample of some of the questions in the tool. Each section is intentionally repetitive to really, some of the questions are like anti-displacement is embedded as a question very early on, because that's something that's not always thought about early on enough in processes. And again, like, has anything changed? Should you go back and change your mapping? Is there things you need to pause and redo? That's very intentional. Last thing I want to say on it too is, you know, we've talked a lot about how our processes are very complicated and hard for even some of us to describe that live in this world and have been doing this. And this work that we're doing did not set out to, you know, make those less complicated. That's a whole other can of worms. It'd be great if we could do that. And we're not saying that every project needs to be done the same way, because projects need to be unique to the community. They need to be unique to the type of roadway within the system that they're addressing, you know, or whatever. But the one thing that we really talked about is use of this framework and tool. That can be the common, that can be the constant. And that's what we really kind of want to message with this next part that I'm going to hand off to Allison in our capacity building and training.
Thank you, Madam Chair and council members. Again, Allison Val, Bellwether Consulting. I've had the privilege of working on transportation equity with and in Met Council since 2011. I was a staffer here in community development and then in Metro Transit for 7 years. And this project has really been a chance to go deep. And, you know, I think along the lines of what we've been talking about, there's definitions of equity, there's values of equity, there's policies, but really it's the slow, hard work of applying those to our bureaucracies in our decision making, and that's what we're doing here. And from the beginning, this was never about just making a tool. That's not the end point. That's just a midpoint or even an early point, really. So it's not going to be a success for us or for you if the tool is a PDF that sits on the website and is just there. So the capacity building and training is where we are now. This is the work of making this a living, breathing practice that implements equity. And it's where we're at now with our team as well. And so I'm going to share some highlights of that. So we are in the middle of a multi-step process right now to develop and test out a training. So how do we spread the word on this? How do we put it into practice? How do we train folks? How do we make this real? And so we've done some pre-tests already with some processes. And in the next few months, we'll be holding a series of 3 longer in-person sessions to apply it to 2 different projects, a transit one and a road project. And so in this pilot, the audience will be the teams of government staff who are working on this at any stage, maybe before it was a project. We want to bring along a lot of different staff. And in the future, I think the game changer, one of the game changers will be bringing in community members and community-based organizations who are in the geographic areas of those processes and projects, and have those community members be part of applying the tool and having the conversations. Otherwise, if it's just the staff, it's like it's an echo chamber. So,
And community should be first, and it should be called, I like you, geographic area instead of project area.
Right. And the EPG is, as we've talked about, the co-chairs have talked about, are going to continue to be involved. The co-chairs are going to continue to be involved. We're figuring out exactly the role. We're delighted that the EPG members want to stay involved. Frankly, it wasn't budgeted for, so we're figuring out how to do that, how to pay for it. We think it could be appropriate for EPG members to be facilitators in the training and be asking the questions because they came up with the questions. And they can also help evaluate the training. Is this actually doing what we want it to do? So next slide, please.
I do have a question, and that is related to the capacity building. Can you just take a short amount of time to explain that? Because I think it kind of touches on what the community member involvement needs are.
Right, so right now when we're talking about capacity building, we're really starting with, we have the EPG who are the tool co-creators and created, are walking with us and leading this process. And then we're taking the tool, the next step is to the cities, counties, MnDOT, Met Council staff, and have them be made aware and helping to test out and apply this tool as part. That is the next step. And then in the future phase, we want to then figure out, can we also bring in additional community members from those geographic areas? Does that answer the question?
Well, that last part is what I'm getting to, is that in bringing in those additional community members, they need to have support for related to capacity in terms of the available time that they have, getting paid for the work, having information resources so that they can get up to speed and be able to communicate with the different stakeholders.
Yes.
So that's what I meant by capacity.
Absolutely. We've done one model here with the EPG. There are many models out there. In fact, my first job at Met Council was about this. It was quarters of opportunity, if anybody remembers that. Right. We had $750,000 from HUD, and a lot of that went to capacity building of community-based organizations. And we had a community engagement team. There was a re-granting CBOs, that's, what is that? 2011, you know, that worked, but you need the money and you need to do it. So there are models like that I think working with CBOs, and this is my opinion, from my experience, is one of the best ways that we can do that. They're embedded in the community, they have their relationships, they have the infrastructure, but they need the funding and the capacity building to be able to engage.
By CBOs, community-based organizations?
Yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I think there's a group that isn't up there, and that's the policymakers and the politicians. If the politicians are doing their thing, staff gets real freaky about getting crosswise with what people around the table that have the power to make the final decision. And I've seen that time and time again where they're not aligned. So if the elected or appointed officials are going in one direction, but the training team is doing all this work over here and staff is reading it differently, then what happens, right? So I hope that the decision makers, elected, appointed, whoever they all are, will also embrace this fully, because if they don't and it gets political, all that goes out the window. And that's not good. And that's where you end up with crises, I believe, within project and after project.
I think these are really good points, and I think perhaps a strategic assessment would need to be done to identify the needs and the gaps and things like that, which I think might have been mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, and that is going to be one of our questions, is how, I love the energy of this whole meeting. How do you all want to continue to be involved and support and connect the dots on this? So we'll get to that. A couple more things on the training and capacity building. So if you go to the next slide, kind of small to see, but let's start with, these are the 3 objectives of this phase of the pilot. I'll start with the last one, which is build an action plan to implement changes in the process. So we want the teams to walk away from this pilot training with specific things that they're going to do and actions they're going to take. And the way they'll get there is number 1 and 2, which is learning about transportation equity and applying the tool to their processes. I do want to just bring up the last slide, I think, on training and capacity building. I think we've already touched on some of these 4 very real tensions that we're navigating right now. The first is the role of project staff versus EPG versus community-based organizations versus policymakers. We're figuring all this out. And as someone said earlier, the Met Council is leading this initiative. A lot of the decision-making may be happening in a city or a county. And so how do we navigate that fragmentation and build those connections together? Secondly, I think with any type of equity work where you run into defensiveness that can be triggered among participants when we're talking about tough conversations and how we're doing our job and if we're doing a good job. And so we're going to be setting the stage that we're all working together collaboratively to do better, and the recognition that this goes beyond, way beyond one person, one staffer. These are systemic issues, these are organizational issues, and so we can take the personality out of it while also thinking about, we've inherited these systems, and it's now our responsibility to change them. So, the third point is, there's so many things going on, right? There's so many initiatives, there's so many priorities, there's limited capacity. How do we make sure it's not siloed? How do we, as someone said earlier, how do we connect this to the other big things going on? Whether that's the regional solicitation, other planning that's going on. How do we raise this up into people's consciousness So this is getting the attention it needs. And then lastly is the EPG has been amazing in leading this, and they don't represent everybody in the community. So we know we need to expand to bring in more community members, to bring in folks from those geographic areas, and we just want to do that in a way that is helpful and not harmful. And so we're trying to figure out when, how, what does that look like? All right, so we are going to shift into some lessons learned now, unless there was any last questions about training capacity building.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is just like circling back to how do we want to use this. Just a few comments and not meant to be like full comprehensive. One, Amy, I am wondering about community benefits, sort of like looking at how this can be paired up and even piloting community benefits on some of the big projects. The second thing is just repeating what Ryan said, which is wrestling between council led projects versus where council is more of a intermediary where we give the financial funding to, because we're either moving state or federal money, and then to the local government. And so I think that still feels like something that we have to wrestle. The third part that I was going to say is City of Chicago did this where they put out contracts, just as we put out contracts for a lot of things, where community organizations, CBOs, are actually eligible to bid on community engagement process. Because one thing that I don't want to establish as an expectation is our planners are really good at planner, because they spent years studying it, and then they get really good at knowing the community, and then do the community engagement, and now get really good at racial equity and equity pieces. And so I think as we think about how complicated projects have gotten, and we think about team holistically, and this is for council, and I'm hoping somebody's taking notes. Like the idea of like council can actually put out bids and make sure there's a community CBO partner on every one of the big projects, and they lead the engagement. Because by the time a planner is knocking on the door, you're just pretty much letting them know what the alignment is and taking some input. And I don't expect planner to be like really good at knowing the ins and outs and the dynamics of community and who's the loud voices, who's not the loud voices, who showed up, who didn't show up. So that's, I think, comprehensively how we think about projects, just thinking differently. And I don't know if that could show up later in as the project, this works on.
Councilmember Johnson.
Just briefly on that, thank you, Councilmember Dolkar. And I would say that working with the community-based organizations, which are great, but also I want to make sure that when they become a contractor for an entity, they don't then feel the pressure to adopt whatever political or agendas are embedded in the entity, right? So there's got to be a way to compensate and bring people into the process, compensate in whatever, I use that term broadly, right? Because they have to be free to make moves, decisions that best represent community and not feel beholden to the parent organization that's pulling the strings, that has the contract focus or scope, and they gotta stay in that, right? Because we all know, and we talked about it, the scope is limiting, and so I agree with you. I think they're the better than probably our internal planners, but I wanna make sure that they are free to do the work that they need to do more broadly, so they don't have to check a box because, you know, it's a paycheck for them, let's be honest. And so I don't think people give up integrity for paychecks, but I think scope and pressure, political pressure especially, can be very constraining to people in a process. And I think community can see right through it.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to comment on sort of the training and training audience. One thing, like this is obviously a big regional effort that we're undergoing here, whether you're looking at this effort, TPP, regional solicitation. It'd be really good to pull some examples from some of our rural centers and smaller cities. You know, a perfect example of something that was an equity project that nobody ever would have looked at a map and said that's an equity project. It was an overpass down in Belle Plaine. It's a city that was completely divided by 169. Growth happened differently on each side of the community. Grocery store and the school was on one side, other things were not on the other side. And just connecting that community made a huge difference. That's a very rural example, but it's a good way to tell the story and narrative so that maybe we get additional buy-in in maybe some communities that don't necessarily immediately see themselves in the work until they have it laid out of, this is what it means. We're talking about how you can make a project equitable for your community.
Thank you, Councilmember. All right, so lessons learned, I'm going to turn this over to the co-chairs. One comment before that, I think you see up on the, don't go past the cake yet. Cake and plaques and wooden frames, what do they have to do with anything? We really feel proud and strongly about the fact that we need to humanize our processes, and relationships matter, and the way we get to trust is through building those relationships, and so we're proud of that. And sometimes it's through those little things like cake and plaques and food and spending time together.
Yes, and the plaque was a great surprise. It was mailed to us, so that was pretty neat with the certificate. So the needs for an equitable investment process. And this just has an equitable process is necessary for an equitable outcome. For one, empowering community members throughout your process is a game changer, even though it adds challenges. And as what's been expressed here, we kind of expressed that a little of some of the challenges that we ran into. And then two, plan for adequate time and budget. So the process that we went through for developing the tool, as was mentioned, took a couple of years. But as you implement the tool, it will take some time, so you'll have to either, I guess maybe carve out time at the beginning of when there's an idea and you're bringing it forward as a project, having time to actually, reach out to the community. And then for the budget piece, you may not get the funds for the project, until you present it. But just having time and budget for that. And then have community members as boots on the ground for the process and project delivery. So with that, and even with the EPG, we talked about now there's people that will advocate, for equitable projects, and they can help spread the word in the community and also let others know when there's an open house for something going on with the project. That we have the Safe Routes to Schools project, so then they have open houses for those every so often and things like that. And then for detailed mapping, homework on the community is very important, and that can include a number of things. We've had different projects and project ideas that they wanted to implement, but they were going to take down all the trees, so then the community kind of rallied against that, and they had to switch the location of the project to another street so that it would not have as much environmental impact in that area. 5, mapping your decision-making process for transparency is very important. Like was mentioned, like you mentioned, the community can tell when someone's being fake or if they're doing something that's underhanded or they have already received buy-in from someone else, but they're just pushing the project onto the community. So being transparent about kind of like where it's coming from, what you're doing, and how this is going to impact you in the future is very important.
Is there anything you want to, add to lessons learned, and Amy, this last part is the future plan work?
Yeah, we'll just pause here on our kind of conclusions. One thing I think maybe we didn't bluntly say here is we feel like our work with the EPG and what we learned in that process is applicable to investment processes. And so it was kind of interesting, and I didn't expect that to occur, that as we worked with the EPG, we're like, oh, well, project processes should really think about this, and this is how you work with communities. So kind of that back and forth of being embedded in what we were doing and the lessons learned being applicable for all project and investment processes I found really interesting. I think I would like to say, there's so much excitement around this work, but it does take time and it's slow, and I think we had some EPG members, not the two of you, but who are frustrated, like, everyone should be using this now. And that is a goal, honestly, over time, but it still will take, some of our future work is the training on the tool, the awareness of the tool, our own evolving the tool as we begin to use it, how it might change. But I can envision, 5 or 10 years from now, a point where as we think about regional solicitation, we say, well, we won't fund this project, or any project we fund has to commit to using this tool. And so that institutionalizing the use of the tool is the ultimate goal. And I don't know how and when we'll get to that, but the training and the daylighting of it is really a big piece of that. So that is some of our work over time is the training. A couple other pieces of work we are thinking about in the near term, this idea of community mapping. It's hard. Project implementers, process implementers need to understand the community that they're working within. And oftentimes we leave that to it's just demographics. But it really is so much more than that. It's understanding the history, particularly the history with the transportation system. It's understanding cultural resources that are in the community. It's understanding destinations. How is the community traveling around this transportation system? How are they using the transportation system? So that idea of how would you do community mapping? We're gonna embark on a project like that over the next year. And the good news on that is I've seen nationally that is a conversation that's happening. We were just at a conference where Rhode Island has a very good tool to think about community mapping and community data. And then an important piece of gathering that data is continuing to use it at every step of the process. I've seen projects that do it at the beginning and somehow at the end of the project it's become disconnected from what they knew about the community. And then the piece we've also talked about is what does it mean to map a process? We're going to have some follow-up work on what that does look like, and particularly what it means to map decision-making and how decisions are made. And I think that's a very important piece of this work is community cannot impact decision-making if they don't understand where and how the decisions are being made. And oftentimes we tell community, this is where we're going to engage with you, but we don't tell them what we're gonna do with the engagement. We don't tell them what it feeds into and how it feeds into decision-making. And so that is part of mapping a process. So those are a couple big pieces of work in the near term, along with continued training on the tool.
Madam Chair. And to that, thank you, Amy, and 5 years gives me a lot of anxiety because there's so much already coming at us in 5 years and throughout this whole region that I don't want people to be left behind or mistrust the process or not know how to engage. And so I would say let's not let perfection get in the way of really good stuff. If we can come up with a short high points that we gotta be looking for some of the stuff early on, I think that's really important. And to your point about it's the we and they. When we tell them, when we show the community, that is just hard language to hear because we're telling them how it goes. We're telling them when to engage. They get to make their own decisions and they should know who their reps are and how they, want to show up for support or against, or I don't know what you're doing, and have different conversations outside of our defined process that we engage. They can come up with a lot of their own engagement ways that are outside of ours. And the other thing about mapping, and you're right about just data, we can, but it's also people's values that don't show up in, surveys or census forms. I mean, how people live might be very different than how the people in a project office lives and values. And that's the stuff that drives people in neighborhoods. You know, they don't show up and go, what does my census block say about me, right? I mean, so I hope that there is an intermediary in this process of people like you who've done this work, because otherwise the trust won't be there. And we see it on projects all the time. And they have the right to say it because we aren't doing it. So I just, again, 5 or plus years, yes, get to, but we've got work going on right now where this could be so beneficial in some short form or some way, because it's not happening the way it should be.
Councilmember Lee?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just want to say again, thank you for all your hard work over 2 years. We're they say fish in water doesn't know that it's in water, and we're the fish and we're the water. And we need the expertise of community members like you and consultants like you who know this stuff and to help us understand where we lag in our processes. If we continue to do the same thing and create inequitable outcomes, then that's on us, and that's exactly why we apparently picked the right folks to be on the EPG. And so thank you. I also want to say kudos for having the word burden on your equity statement and also in the question. I think ultimately, as policymakers, every piece of policy that we put out there, it's ultimately going to benefit some folks, and some folks are going to be a burden. And I think philosophically, we hope that the folks' burden are less, and that's something that we should always remind ourselves. And then the last point is, I wasn't paid to say this, but Alison Bell has a new book. It's called Herocrats. And I assume it's a play on word bureaucrat, but it's about how government folks like us could be agents of change. So just want to put that out there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Administrator?
I mean, I can't beat that last comment. That was great. I just wanted to note, I don't see this as a binary where it's like we have to wait until a certain date to be doing things. And I actually want to lift up that work like this plant seeds along the way, work with the American Indian community as well, that we had that conversation just a few weeks ago in our wastewater areas. It's not as though there's going to be a day when we flip a switch. And I think that's important. And so when we think about the Network Now work happening, conversations around fair policy, thoughtfulness around Nicollet Mall, I'm just citing some examples of real world stuff, whereas I have come to the council and gotten to see the work underway to think about who rides, who has not been allowed to ride, how do we think about who's been disadvantaged, how do we ensure that we get disproportionate input from those who most need or use services today while thinking about our future. And then if you even look at the Network Now documents that are out right now, there are equity analyses of what do we look like before, what do we look like today, and what are we going to look like in the future, broken down across race as well as class. And I think these are really important analyses. That doesn't mean that it solves all of the work, and it does not get to all of the dynamics of what's being talked about here today. But that is a system leaning into work that, frankly, I'm really proud of. This transit system is becoming more equitable over the next 3 years than it has ever been in the past, based on the data we look at in terms of who gets served by the expanded frequencies and coverage across this region. There's some really good stuff there. So we'll continue to lean in, and in the meantime, I appreciate the work that has been going on. You can see how iterative work starts to come back into the office day to day. And to our leaders here, I want to cite that. I mean, this stuff, people come back with new ideas and ways to say, how do we bring this in? How do we start to think about things? And I hope that gets back to you as the work happens as well. You're making a difference already.
Thank you for your comments. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of quick things. Just want to reassure that because this work was going on the same time as we were drafting the 2050 TPP, there's a lot of this built into that document, and obviously Annie's very involved with that as well. So there's a lot already built into it that will be released early next year. But as we go, that document gets updated every 5 years, so we'll make sure it kind of as a rolling process gets tied into that. As Lisa mentioned, we also have the regional solicitation work work group going on right now, which informs the next rounds of the solicitation. It's gonna be informed both by the new TPP, but also by this work and some of the other work that Ryan had been mentioning on some of our transit lines. So it's very important that they're all connected, and but it's up to us to really make sure it stays connected. It was always, you know, in my mind, at least in the transportation world, like, yes, equity was always important, but I want it like embedded so deeply you can't pull it out. And that's kind of the key. And so I think that's really, really critical. A couple of other quick things, just for fellow council members, you heard a lot that these on the advisory committee were able to be paid. We had to take it to an outside organization to coordinate the study so we could do that. So talk to your legislators that this might be a good thing, that we should get out there, that people in our advisory committees, you know, some who, like I said, they're hard to get to, they take a lot of work, especially if you're doing it right. And but yeah, it needs a legislative change for us to be able to do that.
Are we advancing that bill at all as a council?
We're working on it as
Okay,
best
great.
we can.
Okay, thanks.
All right, and then also for my fellow council members, I get asked by a lot of you many times, how do you make a difference, how do you make a change? This came out of the tiny sliver of funding that we have, that we as council members can help allocate. It was under the first Walz administration, so not all of you were here yet, but this was something that we were advocating very heavily for. So this was very important. Each division had their own things, and I had many discussions around this table trying to push for it. So it's very nice to see it come to fruition, because this really makes a big difference. And then lastly, I want to thank Amy and her team for standing this up. For this has been a passion project for her. This was something that was very important. With equity and knowing the investments, it's easy to say disproportionate investments or poor investments lead to disparities, hurt equity, all those different things, but to understand that those big dollars that can go in can really sway things in very big ways. So it's really important to be able to put this lens on everything so that we're investing wisely and investing ways that help the community. And like, I know how hard she worked on this, and thank you all for helping her along in this process, because I think what we're seeing is, you know, little ideas on the table can become big things down the road. So thank you.
Thank you. Do you have more questions or more for us?
No, that wraps it up. And I want to echo the thank you to our EPG co-chairs and the full EPG. Hopefully some of them are listening today. It wasn't a long
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for your work, and I'm hoping that going forward, that the Equity Advisory Committee is gonna be a big part of what you guys are doing. I know like sometimes the ships passing in the night, hopefully those ships will be ultimately sailing to the same port. And you know, this is what I think is the heart of what we should do, and I hope we do even more of this. And again, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much. I think your work has been well received by the Met Council. We're very excited and anxious to see the next steps implemented. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Yeah, gonna have
Yeah.